On a hot summer afternoon in Harlem, a pen hovered over paper, and the future of the most famous boxer on earth hung in the balance. Joe Louis, the Brown Bomber, the heavyweight champion of the world, was seconds away from signing a contract that looked like success, security, and smart business. It promised money, legacy, and peace after the fights were over. What it really promised was control. And Joe didn't know it yet, but that single signature could have cost him everything he had worked for. At just 26 years old, Joe Louis wasn't just a champion. He was a symbol. He was a man who knocked out Max Schmeling and stood tall for millions of black Americans who saw themselves in his victories. Inside the ring, Joe was calm, focused, and unstoppable. Outside the ring, the world was far more dangerous because fame brings attention, and attention attracts people who smile while sharpening knives behind their backs. Joe was making money faster than he could understand it. Big checks, big promises, bigger pressure. Everyone wanted a piece of him. Managers, advisors, friends, and businessmen who spoke smoothly and dressed sharply. On this day, 3 men sat across from him in a small office on 125th Street, selling him a dream. They talked about investments, nightclubs, ownership, and a future where Joe Louis wouldn't have to throw another punch. They told him this was how smart men protected their wealth. The contract on the desk was thick. The words were small. The promises were big. Joe listened carefully, trying to do the right thing. He wasn't greedy. He wasn't careless. He just wanted to protect his family and his future. As he reached for the pen, he believed he was finally taking control of his life outside the ring. But Harlem has its own rules. What Joe didn't know was that this meeting had already been noticed. In Harlem, nothing important happens quietly, especially when outsiders come looking profit from one of its heroes. Word travels fast through barbershops, street corners, and back rooms. And within minutes, the right ears had heard the wrong news. Somewhere nearby, a man who understood contracts better than most, and betrayal better than anyone, was on his way. Bumpy Johnson wasn't a businessman. He wasn't a lawyer. He was something else entirely. To Harlem, he was power, protection, and consequence wrapped in a tailored suit. He knew how men got trapped without ever being touched. He knew how paper could steal more than guns. And when he walked into that office, everything changed. Joe's pen hadn't touched the paper yet. The door was about to open, and the men selling dreams were about to realize they had stepped into the wrong neighborhood at the wrong time. The door opened without a knock. No warning, no hesitation. Just the sound of hinges moving and footsteps that carried confidence. The 3 men in suits turned first. Joe Louis looked up last. He recognized the face immediately, even if he didn't fully understand the weight that came with it. Bumpy Johnson stepped inside like the room belonged to him, calm and controlled, his eyes taking everything in at once. The desk, the contract, the pen resting inches from Joe's hand. For a moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavier, like something unseen had entered with him. Joe knew of Bumpy Johnson the same way most people in Harlem did. Not through introductions, but through reputation. He wasn't a public figure. He didn't give speeches or seek attention. Yet everyone knew his name. They knew he controlled what needed controlling and protected what needed protecting. Some called him dangerous. Others called him necessary. In Harlem, those 2 ideas often meant the same thing. Bumpy didn't rush. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Joe and said, quiet and steady, "You all right here?" It wasn't a question meant for a quick answer. It was a signal. Joe hesitated, confused by the interruption, unsure why this man had shown up at all. Before he could respond, one of the businessmen cleared his throat, forcing a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We're in the middle of a private meeting," the man said. "Business matters." Bumpy nodded slightly, as if he'd heard that line before, because he had. Many times. Business was always the excuse. It was always business when someone wanted to take something they hadn't earned. He glanced down at the contract, then back at the men across the desk. He didn't touch anything. He didn't need to. Joe shifted in his chair. Part of him felt embarrassed, like he'd been caught doing something wrong. Another part felt relieved, though he couldn't explain why. The truth was, Joe Louis had spent most of his life being told what to do. Trainers told him when to punch. Managers told him where to go. Promoters told him what fights mattered. This meeting felt no different. He assumed this was just how the world worked. What Joe didn't know was how often that assumption was used against him. The men in suits kept talking, repeating promises they had already made. They spoke about ownership, expansion, and long-term security. They spoke faster now, as if speed could drown out the tension in the room. Their words were polished, rehearsed, and confident. They wanted Joe focused on the future they were selling, not the man standing behind him. Bumpy listened without interrupting. He studied faces, not words. He noticed the way one man avoided eye contact, the way another clenched his jaw when Joe hesitated. These were not the habits of patient investors. These were the habits of men who needed a deal signed before questions were asked. Joe's mind drifted back to the life he came from, to Detroit, to his mother working hard so he could eat, to the years before fame, when survival mattered more than money. He hadn't grown up learning contracts or investments. He learned discipline. He learned endurance. He learned how to keep moving forward even when the odds were stacked against him. That was why this moment mattered more than any title defense. Outside the building, Harlem moved as it always did. Street vendors called out to passing crowds. Music spilled from open windows. Kids laughed, men argued. Life went on. But inside that small office, something fragile was being tested. Trust, power, and the future of a man the world believed was invincible. Bumpy finally stepped closer to the desk. Not close enough to touch anything, just close enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. His voice stayed calm, almost casual, as he asked a simple question meant for everyone in the room. Who brought you gentlemen into Harlem? No one answered. Joe looked from Bumpy to the contract and back again. The pen was still untouched. The promises were still hanging in the air. And somewhere between silence and truth, Joe began to realize that this meeting was never just about money. It was about who had the right to decide his future. And that decision hadn't been made yet. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The men in suits exchanged quick glances, each waiting for someone else to speak first. They were used to controlling rooms with words, not being challenged by them, especially not by someone who hadn't raised his voice once. Joe Louis felt it too. The shift in power, subtle but unmistakable. For the first time since the meeting began, the conversation wasn't being guided by promises or pressure. One of the men finally answered, carefully choosing his words. He said they were invited by opportunity, by business, by the idea that Harlem was growing and smart investors should be part of that growth. It sounded reasonable, almost convincing, but something about the way he said it made Joe uneasy. It felt rehearsed, like a line practice in front of a mirror. Bumpy listened, nodding slowly. He'd heard similar explanations many times before, often right before someone lost more than money. He glanced at Joe again, noticing the uncertainty on his face. Joe wasn't weak. He was cautious, and in a world that punished caution with urgency, that made him vulnerable, Joe thought about how fast everything had changed in his life. One moment, he was just a kid with heavy hands and a dream. The next, he was a heavyweight champion, his name printed in newspapers across the country. People spoke to him differently now. They smiled more. They offered help he never asked for. Everyone seemed to know what was best for him, even when they barely knew him at all. The men across the desk continued talking, explaining details Joe hadn't asked about. They emphasized deadlines, mentioning how rare this chance was and how quickly it could disappear. Joe recognized that tone. He'd heard it from promoters before big fights. The push to decide now, before doubt could catch up, before anyone had time to think. Bumpy took a step back and let them talk. He wanted Joe to hear it all. Not just the words, but the rhythm behind them, the pressure, the urgency, the quiet warning that said, sign now or lose everything. Bumpy believed people learned best when they saw the trap forming for themselves. From the hallway outside, footsteps passed by. Someone laughed. Life kept moving, unaware of the moment unfolding behind the closed door. Inside, Joe felt the weight of expectation pressing down on him. He wanted to believe the deal was real. He wanted to believe that this was how successful men planned their future. But a voice inside him, faint but growing, told him something wasn't right. He looked again at the contract. The pages were thick, the text dense and unfamiliar. He realized he hadn't truly read it, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how. Nobody had ever taught him what questions to ask. Nobody had ever warned him how dangerous confidence could be when it came wrapped in kindness. Bumpy finally spoke again, his tone steady. He asked Joe where his own lawyer was, his own advisor, someone whose paycheck didn't depend on getting this deal signed today. The question landed hard. Joe didn't have an answer. The men in suits tried to jump in, but Bumpy held up a hand, not aggressively, just firmly. Joe felt exposed, but also protected. For the first time in that office, someone was speaking to him, not at him. Someone wasn't selling him a future, but asking him to slow down and see the present clearly. The men sensed a shift. Their confidence began to crack. Replaced by tension they couldn't smooth over with smiles. They knew time was no longer on their side. And Joe Lewis, the man they thought they could rush, was starting to understand that this meeting wasn't just about an investment. It was about who controlled the next chapter of his life. And the answer to that question was still hanging in the air. The room felt smaller now, like the walls had quietly moved closer. Joe could hear his own breathing, slow but heavy, as if his body sensed danger before his mind fully accepted it. The men across the desk were still talking, but their voices had changed. The smooth confidence was thinning, replaced by explanations that sounded more like defenses. They were no longer selling a dream. They were trying to hold on to control. One of them pointed at the contract again, tapping a specific page, insisting everything was standard procedure. He said this was how serious business worked. Lawyers would slow things down. Questions would kill opportunities. Joe had heard that argument before in boxing. Don't think too much, just sign, just fight. It had always worked in the ring. But this wasn't a ring. There were no clear rules here, no referee to step in. Bumpy watched Joe closely. He didn't interrupt, didn't argue line by line. He knew pressure exposed truth better than confrontation. The longer this went on, the more the cracks showed. One man kept checking the door. Another wiped sweat from his forehead. Their urgency grew louder with every passing second. Joe felt torn. Part of him still wanted this to be real. He wanted to believe that people saw him as more than a fighter, that they respected him enough to offer something honest. But another part of him, the part that had survived poverty and pressure, began asking quiet questions. Why the rush? Why today? Why here? Outside, a siren passed somewhere in the distance, fading as quickly as it came. Harlem kept breathing. Inside, time felt frozen. Bumpy finally moved closer to Joe's side of the desk. Not looming, not threatening, just present. He spoke softly, almost like advice shared between rounds. He reminded Joe how many people made money because Joe stepped into a ring. Promoters, broadcasters, arenas, entire industries built on his fists. He asked Joe a simple question. Who benefits most if this deal goes bad? No one answered that one. Joe's hand drifted toward the pen again, then stopped. His fingers hovered, uncertain. The men leaned forward slightly, sensing the moment they'd been waiting for. This was the edge, the point of no return. If the pen touched paper, everything changed. Bumpy's eyes shifted to the contract once more. He didn't read it. He didn't need to. He'd seen enough men lose everything because they trusted words over instincts. He asked one last question, calmly, almost casually, directed at the men in suits. He asked what would happen if Joe decided not to sign today. The answer came too fast, too sharp, too defensive. They said the opportunity would disappear, that others were waiting, that Joe would regret it. The words spilled out, rushed and tense. And in that moment, Joe understood something important. Real opportunities don't threaten. They wait. The room went quiet again, thicker than before. Joe leaned back slightly, his eyes moving from face to face. He saw calculation. He saw impatience. And for the first time, he saw fear. Not fear of him, but fear of losing control of the situation. Bumpy straightened his jacket and rested one hand lightly on the desk. His presence alone shifted the balance. The men felt it. Joe felt it. Whatever happened next would change more than just this meeting. The pen was still untouched. The contract was still unsigned, and everyone in the room knew they were standing at the edge of something they couldn't walk back from. Joe was about to speak when the smallest man in the room did something unexpected. Anthony, the one who had barely said a word since Bumpy arrived, reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document. It wasn't part of the original stack. It was thinner, cleaner, and placed on the desk with careful hands, like a peace offering. He said it was just an addendum, a small clarification, nothing serious, just something their lawyers required before final approval. That's when Bumpy's expression finally changed. Not anger, not threat, recognition. He had seen this move before, when pressure failed. Paperwork multiplied. When a deal started slipping, the trap got deeper. The addendum wasn't there to protect Joe. It was there to close the door behind him once he stepped inside. Joe leaned forward, curiosity mixed with tension. He scanned the first few lines. The language was even more confusing than the original contract. More conditions, more technical terms. His stomach tightened. He felt like he was being pushed into water he didn't know how to swim in. Anthony spoke quickly now, explaining how this document actually made things safer. He said it gave the partners more flexibility. He said it was standard. He said everyone signed these things. His voice cracked just slightly, enough for Joe to notice. Bumpy asked one quiet question. He asked why this document hadn't been mentioned earlier. Anthony hesitated. That hesitation did more damage than any argument could. Joe's heartbeat picked up. The room suddenly felt unbalanced, like a table with one short leg. He realized something else too. This meeting was never supposed to include Bumpy Johnson. This second document wasn't part of the plan. It was damage control. One of the other men tried to regain control, talking over Anthony, insisting everything was still on track. He mentioned Joe's schedule, his next fight, how distractions like this could hurt performance. It was subtle, but the message was clear. Sign now, stay focused. Don't overthink it. Joe felt a flash of anger beneath the uncertainty. He didn't like being rushed. He didn't like being managed outside the ring the same way opponents try to back him into corners inside it. Bumpy turned slightly toward Joe, lowering his voice so only he could hear. He told Joe that real partners never surprise you at the last second. Real partners don't need confusion to win. And real opportunities don't multiply documents when questions start getting asked. The men sensed the ground shifting again. One of them stood up, pretending to stretch, but his eyes kept flicking toward the door. Another loosened his tie. The confidence that filled the room earlier was gone, replaced by unease. Joe looked down at both documents on the desk. 2 stacks of paper. 2 futures. One built on trust he didn't fully understand. The other built on walking away without answers. Outside, footsteps slowed near the office door, then stopped. Someone else was listening now. And suddenly, this wasn't just a bad deal. It was becoming a problem that was much bigger than money. The footsteps outside didn't move away. They stayed right there, close enough to be felt. The men in suits noticed it at the same time Joe did. Their eyes shifted. The room went quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't hesitation anymore. It was realization. Bumpy finally spoke, and this time his voice carried weight. He asked Anthony to read one specific line from the addendum. Just one. Anthony tried to skip past it, but Bumpy insisted. Slowly, reluctantly, Anthony read out loud. The words landed hard. If Joe signed both documents, controlled his investment, and any future earnings tied to it, will be transferred fully to the partners for a fixed term, a term that quietly reset every year. Joe understood that part clearly. That wasn't partnership. That was ownership. The men started talking all at once, trying to explain it away. They said it was temporary. They said it was standard. They said Joe would never even notice. But Joe wasn't listening anymore. Something had clicked. In the ring, he knew the moment an opponent overcommit. This felt the same. They had shown their hand. Joe stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor, cutting through the noise. Everyone froze. Joe looked at the papers one last time, then pushed them gently to the center of the desk. His voice was calm, but steady. He said he wasn't signing anything. Not today. Not ever. One of the men tried to argue. Another raised his voice. That's when Bumpy stepped forward, not threatening, not loud, just certain. He said the meeting was over. He said the deal was dead. And he said something else that made the room go cold. He said Harlem already knew why they were there. The color drained from their faces. Bumpy explained that when outsiders came into Harlem chasing fast money, people noticed. And when those outsiders targeted someone like Joe Louis, people talked. Word had already spread. Names had been mentioned. Doors that were open before were quietly closing. The men gathered their things in a hurry now. No more smiles. No more promises. Just nervous movements and forced dignity. As they reached the door, Bumpy added one final sentence. Calm and unmistakable. He said they shouldn't come back looking for Joe Louis. Not with deals. Not with advice. Not with opportunities. They left without another word. Joe exhaled, realizing how tight his chest had been. The room felt lighter, safer. He turned to Bumpy and thanked him, unsure how else to express what he felt. Bumpy simply nodded. He said Joe didn't need saving. He just needed time to see clearly. As they stepped out into the Harlem street, Joe thought it was over, but Bumpy paused and delivered the final twist. He told Joe this wasn't the first contract like that, and it wouldn't be the last. That there were more people watching Joe than he realized. Some friendly, some not. And now that word had spread that Joe Louis wasn't alone, the game had changed. Joe looked back at the building, understanding something new. He hadn't just walked away from a bad deal. He had stepped into a world where power, protection, and trust mattered just as much as strength. And nothing would be the same again. The walk down 125th Street felt different for Joe Louis. The noise, the movement, the people, it all seemed sharper, more real. Just minutes earlier, he'd been sitting in a quiet office, inches away from signing something that could have taken years of his life without him even realizing it. Now he was back in Harlem, breathing freely, feeling the weight lift off his shoulders one step at a time. Joe broke the silence first. He admitted he felt embarrassed. He said he should have known better, that he was supposed to be smart, disciplined, careful. Bumpy stopped in mid-sentence. He told Joe that strength didn't mean knowing everything. It meant knowing when to pause, knowing when to listen, knowing when to ask for help. Too many men, especially successful ones, got trapped because they thought asking questions made them look weak. They walked past familiar faces. People nodded at Joe with pride. Others acknowledged Bumpy with quiet respect. Harlem hadn't changed in the last hour, but Joe had. He realized that being heavyweight champion didn't protect him from people who worked with paper instead of fists. In some ways, it made him a bigger target. Joe asked how Bumpy knew the deal was bad so quickly. Bumpy explained that scams repeat themselves. The names change. The promises get dressed up. But the pressure, the urgency, the confusion, that part never changes. He said any deal that rushes you is already working against you. Any contract you don't understand isn't written for you. They stopped near a corner where the street opened up, sunlight cutting through the buildings. Bumpy told Joe he didn't owe him anything. Not money, not favors. He said Harlem took care of its own, and Joe was more than a boxer. He was proof that a kid from nothing could become something the world couldn't ignore. Protecting that mattered. Over the next few weeks, Joe followed through on what he'd learned. He hired his own lawyer, not someone recommended by promoters or business partners, but someone whose only job was to protect Joe Louis. Contracts slowed down. Deals got smaller. Some opportunities disappeared altogether. And that was fine. The right one stayed. Word spread quietly that Joe Louis wasn't easy to corner anymore, that he asked questions, that he walked away, that he didn't move without understanding what was in front of him. The same people who once rushed him stopped calling. Others approached more carefully, respectfully. Bumpy kept his distance after that day. He didn't interfere. He didn't hover. He didn't need to. The lesson had already landed. Joe had learned how to protect himself outside the ring, and that mattered more than any single fight. Joe went on to defend his heavyweight title again and again. Each victory added to his legend. Each paycheck reminded him of how close he'd come to losing control of his own future. He still made mistakes. Everyone does. But he never forgot that afternoon in Harlem, when a pen nearly cost him everything. Years later, when Joe was older and the spotlight wasn't as bright, people would ask him how he handled fame, pressure, and business in a world that didn't always play fair. Joe would smile and say he learned the hard way that success attracts danger and that not every smiling face wants to see you win. Bumpy Johnson passed away before he could see how much that moment mattered, but his name lived on in Harlem, carried through stories like this one, not as a hero, not as a villain, but as someone who understood power and used it, at least that day, to stop something wrong. The men who brought that contract into Harlem were never seen around Joe Louis again. They moved on to easier targets, quieter rooms, faster signatures. Harlem wasn't welcoming to people who tried to take without understanding the ground they stood on. For Joe, the lesson stayed simple. Being great at what you do is enough. You have to protect it. You have to slow down when the world tells you to rush. You have to read what's written in small print, and not just believe what's said out loud. That August day in 1940 didn't end with violence or headlines. It ended with a man standing up from a desk and choosing control over temptation. It ended with a champion learning that the biggest fights don't always come with gloves. And that's the part of Joe Louis's story that doesn't get talked about enough. Because sometimes the most important victory is the one that never makes the papers, but saves your life all the same.